The morning sun glimmered across the vast iron gates of the Marlowe estate, painting the golden details with an almost heavenly glow. From a distance, the mansion looked like a symbol of wealth and perfection, its towering columns, sprawling gardens, and polished marble fountains sparkling in the early light. Yet inside those gates, what unfolded was anything but heavenly. A woman in an elegant emerald dress, her jewelry glittering as if she were draped in power itself, stood tall at the top of the stone steps. Her face was twisted with disdain, her lips curved into a cruel sneer, as she tilted a heavy bucket of dirty water over an older woman and a little girl. The liquid cascaded down in a merciless wave, staining their modest clothes, splattering across the white marble ground, and carrying with it the bitter stench of humiliation. The little girl let out a muffled cry, her small hands clutching her grandmother's arm in desperate fear. The older woman, frail in frame yet strong in spirit, stood motionless, silently shielding the child as best she could. Her eyes, filled with quiet dignity, refused to rise to meet the cruelty above her. For a moment the estate, usually filled with laughter, music, and the gentle rustling of garden trees, seemed to fall silent. But the sound of the iron gates creaking open broke the stillness, masking the roar of a sleek black luxury car pulling into the courtyard. From it stepped Alexander Marlowe, the billionaire heir everyone admired, but few truly knew. His life had been measured in contracts, global deals, and headlines that painted him as untouchable. But what his eyes locked upon in that instant shook him in a way no business failure ever could. He froze in disbelief. His gaze fell on the cruel act before him. His fiancée, Isabella, standing with a bucket in her hand, her poise stripped away by the ugliness of her deed. And in that single moment his world shifted. The golden illusion he had believed in cracked like shattered glass. If you believe kindness and second chances are what make this world brighter, then please pause for a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kind Heart Stories, where tales of humanity and hope come alive. Alexander Marlowe had always been a man of precision. His days were carved into schedules, his nights often swallowed by endless meetings, negotiations, and boardroom decisions. He was a man who planned every move, a man who believed he controlled every outcome. But on that particular day, he had allowed himself a rare break from routine. He had returned home unannounced, hoping to surprise his family. His heart had carried a vision, an afternoon spent laughing with his 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, perhaps tending to the roses in the garden with his mother, Eleanor, or even sitting down with Isabella to discuss the details of their upcoming wedding. For weeks, he had lived out of suitcases, jumping from city to city, his thoughts often drifting to his family, longing for their warmth in the midst of his ruthless world. This visit was meant to be joyful, a homecoming, a reminder of the love that anchored him. But fate had written something different. Eleanor Marlowe, his mother, was a woman of grace. In her early 60s, she carried herself with a poise that no adversity could bend. Widowed in her 40s, she had raised Alexander alone after the untimely passing of his father. She had been mother and father, teacher and protector, building within him a resilience that later defined his rise to power. And then there was Sophie, his daughter, his little miracle. Precious Sophie had lost her mother when she was just 2 years old, too young to understand loss, yet touched by it all the same. Since that moment, Eleanor had stepped seamlessly into both roles, grandmother and mother, her arms always open, her love always unfailing. For Alexander, these two women were not just family. They were his anchor, his heart, his very reason to withstand the storms of power and the loneliness of wealth. They were his sanctuary in a world that often demanded more of him than he could give. Isabella, however, came from a different world. She was stunning, an image of beauty that seemed sculpted for magazine covers and ballroom entrances. Her words flowed like poetry, eloquent and charming, and she carried herself with an air of perfection that dazzled every room she entered. To outsiders, she was a flawless match for a billionaire, a woman who could wear the Marlowe name like a crown. But beneath that polished exterior was a coldness, a hunger for status, a need to command, a subtle cruelty that Eleanor had quietly sensed from the very beginning. Though her instincts warned her, she never voiced her concerns to her son, believing he was too enamored, too blinded by love and appearances to listen. Now, as Alexander stood in the courtyard, the truth was no longer hidden. It was laid bare before him, in the trembling of his child's shoulders, in the quiet strength of his mother's eyes, and in the unmasked malice of the woman he had intended to marry. His heart clenched with a mixture of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. For the first time in years, he was not a billionaire. He was not the powerful Marlowe heir. He was simply a son and a father, staring at the fragility of the world he thought he had built. And in that moment, Alexander Marlowe understood something that money, power, and prestige had never taught him. True love and kindness cannot be faked, and cruelty, no matter how well disguised, always reveals itself in the end. She had endured Isabella's subtle insults for months, the sharp-edged remarks disguised as casual comments, the cold, dismissive looks that cut deeper than words, and the way Isabella treated the household staff as if they were invisible, less than human. Eleanor bore it all in silence, not because she lacked strength, but because she refused to plant seeds of doubt in her son's heart. She knew Alexander's life was already burdened with business wars and corporate rivalries. The last thing she wanted was to weigh him down with fears about the woman he believed he loved. But what Eleanor never expected, what she never could have imagined, was that Isabella's cruelty, one day, would spill beyond the private daggers she threw at her, and fall upon Sophie, her innocent granddaughter. That morning had begun with joy. The sun had risen gently, casting its golden warmth across the Marlowe estate. The sound of birds filled the air, mingling with the trickle of water from the grand fountain. Eleanor and Sophie had been playing nearby, their laughter rising in bursts that carried through the courtyard. Sophie, with her little basket, had been collecting wildflowers, kneeling in the grass, her giggles echoing every time a butterfly fluttered too close to her face. Her curls bounced with each step, her eyes shining with the innocent wonder that only a 7-year-old could hold. Eleanor watched her with a tender smile, her heart swelling with gratitude. She often thought of how fleeting childhood was, how quickly joy could slip away, and so she treasured every laugh, every little flower Sophie picked and proudly presented to her. But then Isabella appeared. She emerged like a storm into that peaceful scene, her emerald gown gleaming as though it belonged on a runway, her face painted with irritation at the sight before her. Her heels struck the stone path sharply, announcing her presence like a warning bell. Her eyes scanned the garden with disdain and then fixed themselves on Eleanor and Sophie. Her lips curled into a sneer. "Is this what we've come to?" she hissed, her voice dripping with contempt, letting the child run wild, turning this estate into a playground for weeds and dirt. Eleanor, as always, met cruelty with patience. Her tone was soft, her words chosen with care. "I apologize, Isabella. We were only enjoying the morning. Come, Sophie, let's gather our things." She reached for her granddaughter's hand, ready to retreat, ready to shield her from the sting of cruelty. But Isabella, agitated and hungry for control, decided an apology was not enough. Her eyes darkened, her jaw clenched, and in a moment that revealed the truest part of her heart, she seized a bucket of dirty water, one meant for cleaning the marble steps. Without hesitation, without a shred of remorse, she tilted it forward. The water spilled in a cruel, deliberate arc, descending on them with a splash that echoed in the courtyard. It struck Eleanor first, drenching her frail body, soaking the fabric of her dress until it clung heavily to her skin. Then it poured over Sophie, her small frame trembling, her scream piercing the silence, the child's tiny arms wrapped tightly around her grandmother, her sobs muffled against Eleanor's chest. Eleanor, shaking from the cold shock, instinctively curved her body to shield Sophie, though her own body absorbed most of the water, and there stood Isabella, her lips twisted into a smirk, her eyes glinting with a satisfaction so twisted that it seemed almost inhuman. "This is what you deserve," she whispered under her breath, her voice venomous. She believed no one would see, no one of consequence would ever know, but she was wrong. Alexander had seen everything. He had arrived home that morning earlier than expected, his car slipping through the gates quietly, his heart filled with anticipation to surprise his family. And now, from just a few paces away, he watched the woman he thought he loved pour cruelty over the two people he cherished most in this world. His breath caught in his throat. His chest tightened. For a moment he was frozen, unable to process what his eyes were showing him, unable to reconcile the image of Isabella he carried in his mind with the heartless figure before him, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw locked with a fury he had not felt in years. And his heart felt as though it had been stabbed, not once, but 100 times over. For months he had adored Isabella. He had defended her when others questioned her intentions. He had envisioned a future where she stood at his side, a partner, a mother figure for Sophie, someone who would help him build a family again. And now, in the span of a single breath, those dreams shattered like glass beneath his feet. Slowly, deliberately, Alexander walked forward. His footsteps echoed against the stone driveway, each one heavier, louder, carrying the weight of his rage and heartbreak. Isabella turned at the sound. Her confidence faltered instantly. The color drained from her face. Her smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear. For a moment she tried to recover her poise, her lips parting in a nervous laugh. "Alexander, it isn't what it looks like." But his silence was louder than any words. His eyes burned into her, filled with disappointment, betrayal, and an anger so deep that Isabella's hands began to tremble at her sides. She stuttered excuses, scrambling for an escape from the truth he had witnessed. She was careless, Isabella tried, her voice cracking under his unrelenting stare. She let Sophie run wild. She was clumsy. The child was misbehaving. This was a lesson, but her words hung in the air like poison, failing to disguise the cruelty he had seen with his own eyes. And Alexander Marlowe, the man who had once believed he controlled every outcome, every deal, every destiny, realized in that moment that his greatest mistake was trusting the woman who now stood before him, a woman whose beauty had hidden a heart of ice. But Alexander saw through every lie. He did not need explanations, excuses, or carefully spun words. The truth was already written in the trembling form of his mother, in the frightened sobs of his daughter, and in the cruel satisfaction that had moments earlier darkened Isabella's face. He moved with quiet determination. Slowly, he knelt down beside his mother and child, not caring that the marble ground was wet, not caring that his expensive tailored suit soaked through instantly with the filth of that water. He gathered them both into his arms. Sophie buried her face into his chest, her little shoulders shaking, her voice breaking between sobs as she whispered, "Daddy." I was scared. Her tiny hands clutched his shirt desperately, as though letting go would mean losing her only safe place. Eleanor, her silver hair damp, her body shivering slightly from the cold splash, rested a hand against her son's arm. Her voice, steady but edged with fragility, said, "Don't worry about me, Alexander. I'll be fine." But Alexander knew better. This was not about spilled water. It was not about a ruined dress or a moment of rudeness. It was about something far deeper, about dignity, about love, about respect. Things Isabella had trampled on without hesitation, without remorse, revealing the truth she had hidden so carefully. In that instant, something inside him hardened. The man who had once entertained dreams of a life built with Isabella, who had defended her in conversations, who had convinced himself that she would one day grow into a gentle stepmother for Sophie, that man was gone. The engagement ended that very day. There were no raised voices, no arguments, no chance for Isabella to twist the story in her favor. Alexander stood tall, his arm protectively around Sophie, his hand steady on his mother's shoulder. And he looked Isabella directly in the eye. His voice, calm but resolute, carried more weight than any anger could. Leave. That single word was final. Her protests began immediately. She tried to laugh it off, to insist that Eleanor had been clumsy, that Sophie had been unruly, that Alexander was misunderstanding the entire moment. When that failed, her tone shifted, pleading, desperate, her eyes filling with crocodile tears. "Alexander, you can't mean this. We're engaged. We have plans. Please, you know how much I love you. Don't let one mistake ruin everything." But her words fell flat, because in that courtyard, beneath the golden gates of the Marlowe estate, and under the wide-open sky that had witnessed her cruelty, Alexander realized something crystal clear. No amount of wealth, no measure of beauty, no height of social status could ever replace the simple truth of kindness. And Isabella had failed the most important test. Her desperate cries followed him, echoing through the stone walls as the staff watched in silence. But Alexander did not waver. He did not turn back. He did not give her the dignity of a second glance. The news of the broken engagement spread quickly. Within hours, whispers rippled through high society. The gossip columns filled with speculation. Had Isabella betrayed him? Had Alexander discovered some scandal? Was it Eleanor who had driven a wedge between them? But Alexander did not care. For the first time in his life, society's whispers were nothing more than background noise. His focus was entirely on the two people who had never once failed him, his mother and his daughter. The days that followed were quiet, but filled with a warmth that soothed the wounds of that morning. He surprised Sophie with little adventures, picnics on the green lawns, treasure hunts in the garden, and evenings spent curled up together as he read her the bedtime stories he had so often missed while traveling the world. He let her fall asleep against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, knowing she would never again have to doubt the safety of his love. With Eleanor, he found comfort in the simplest of moments. They sat together in the sunlit conservatory, a pot of tea between them, the fragrance of jasmine filling the air. He listened, really listened, as she spoke of his father, of the lessons life had taught her, of the quiet strength it took to raise a boy into a man alone. Each conversation reminded him that she was not just his mother. She was the cornerstone of his life, the reason he had never strayed too far from his values, even in the ruthless storm of business. Slowly, the shadows of that awful morning began to fade. They were replaced by the gentle light of healing, by the laughter of a child, and by the unshakable bond of a family that had weathered yet another storm together. And Alexander learned something priceless. True love was not found in beauty, nor in charm, nor in the perfection society so eagerly applauded. True love revealed itself in how a person treated those who could offer them nothing in return. Isabella, for all her elegance and eloquence, had failed that test miserably. But Eleanor and Sophie, with their quiet resilience and pure hearts, had reminded him of life's greatest treasures, the bonds of family, the power of compassion, and the courage it takes to walk away from toxicity. No matter how dazzling it appears on the surface, if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Kind Heart Stories. Every click helps us spread more stories that remind the world of the power of kindness, of family, and of love that cannot be bought. Before we close this chapter, I have one request for you. Drop a comment below and share what kindness means to you, because in the end, Alexander's story is not just about betrayal. It is about awakening. It is about realizing that true wealth is not measured in gold or diamonds, but in the love that holds a family together, even when the world tries to tear them apart. And sometimes it takes witnessing cruelty to finally understand the priceless value of kindness.